One of the most funny things you will ever witness when you study mainstream history is the mainstream historians' absolute inability to look at histories and mythologies of other cultures all over this planet and realize that they're all talking about identical events that our ancestors experienced back in the day. And it's funny because this stuff is not hidden in any sense of the word. Everybody's stories are out there in the open, everybody's mythologies are right there, and there's no real other way to interpret these histories other than what they are saying. Now, historians, what they do is the main thing they do is they ignore this, right? Most historians they don't care about mythology. Right, they're not interested in the religion or their deep histories, because the reality is, for your average person, a lot of these histories simply sound insane. And that's the problem, because what we face now is that we have an entire population in the West that honestly believes that they are operating in the best interests of science, while also simultaneously completely ignoring the scientific method. So what has happened is that mainstream historians now have this false sense of hubris, right? They think they have everything locked down because, oh, we're so smart now, right? We figured out all of this scientific stuff, and I have the internet, and all I have to do now is Google an answer, and there will be, 50 different papers that will confirm whatever I'm thinking about, right? Not to mention that we now know that like 99% of all scientific papers nowadays are absolute garbage, but that's an entirely different story. But it's out there. Hell, even the mainstream has now acknowledged that. That's what's funny. Even the scientific paper situation is so bad right now that even the mainstream has had to come out and start running articles about it because it's that corrupt. I mean, it is that bad. Anyway, but what has happened over the last few decades especially is that modern people now believe that they've got it all locked down, right? We have all the history. We figured out all the chronology. We have all the perfect dating methods that give us the exact dates that, we expected, oddly enough. And since the science agrees with us, we must be right. And what has happened now over these past few decades is that now everybody has this false sense of security when it comes to thinking that they have a great understanding of history. Now, nothing could be further from the truth, and basically everybody knows that on some level. I mean, I'm sure there's some really far gone people out there that could never even comprehend this, even on a subconscious level. But the reality is most people somewhere deep down, they know that we don't have this stuff locked down like it's presented to the general public. I mean, the reality is there's still tons of room for discoveries, and that's the funny part, or that's the ironic. Is it ironic, funny? It's all of this. The funny part about this whole thing is that when people get into these subjects, they immediately see that there is a ton of room for growth, because there are legitimately a bajillion questions out there that mainstream history and science has not answered to almost anyone's satisfaction. But here is where it gets funny. What happens is that innocent historian goes into the mainstream, and then what they immediately discover is that there is absolutely no room for shifting the paradigm relative to the mainstream chronology. So if you don't immediately buy into all of the BS being taught at that level, you are immediately going to be excommunicated from whatever mainstream institution you ended up joining. And then even worse, if you continue to press the truth, if you continue to try and follow real evidence, that goes against the current mainstream paradigm, right? Not only are you excommunicated, but then you're also a conspiracy theorist. You're crazy. This guy is insane. He believes in flat earth and aliens and dimensions and devil. It's just the whole psychological, game starts to get played with that person, and all of those labels are attached to that person, and then that person is socially destroyed. It's almost like those techniques are designed to eliminate people in society without physically killing them. Something to think about, but it's true, isn't it? I mean, that is exactly what happens. Whenever, I mean, we have so many examples of this going on in science and history that it's ridiculous. I mean, for anybody to say that this stuff is not happening and that science is operating using the actual scientific method, or historians are only looking for the truth, those people are liars. I mean, they are scientifically, provably liars, and you don't have to listen to them. That's the beauty of calling out somebody who's a liar, is that you no longer have to pay attention to them. So what I'm saying is that don't worry about the mainstream, right? Don't worry about what the mainstream says about whatever the hell we talk about. Okay, anyway, I promised myself I would get to the subject matter quickly today. I'm working on that. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so anyway, in history, one of the very interesting problems that we run into is the fact that cultures all over the world have identical stories in their histories, right? And a lot of these stories that are identical do indeed have to do with catastrophism, right? We have all kinds of stories of the gods fighting up in the sky, you know, earthquakes, floods, blah, blah, blah on Earth, and everybody on this planet seems to record those stories like almost perfectly to a T. The only time you ever see differences in those stories is relative to wherever they may have been geographically on Earth. So what I mean by that is, so if some massive event is happening globally, right, somebody up in the northern part of the world is going to see a different part of the sky than somebody in the southern part of the world, right? So events that so while there might be one huge event, it might not be a total 360-degree blanket event, right? Maybe somebody in the northern hemisphere sees, I don't know, all kinds of crazy stuff, but somebody in the southern hemisphere, while they will be being affected by this stuff, they might not see the exact same phenomena. So if people are not witnessing the exact same phenomena, you know, they'll record it differently, even though it is the exact same event. What happens is that mainstream historians will pick up on this particular perspective, and then they will say, well, I mean, look, everybody's stories are actually different, bro. I mean, they're not all identical, you know, and they take that and they run with it. Well, I shouldn't say they run with it. They say that and then they drop it and then they leave because they don't want to hear anybody's rebuttal to, you know, what I just said, right? I mean, it's like historians, they just sit on their high horse, and, you know, you're not allowed to challenge them because they are on a high horse and you're not, right? That's the whole situation. Okay, anyway, so in history, we have all these similarities across the globe. And we've talked a lot about catastrophes and stuff because that is one of the main similarities that all cultures seem to share. And in all honesty, they're probably the most prevalent, and they're also some of the most cool. So most people, you know, pretty much stick to that stuff, and they don't dive too much further into the other oddities that these cultures end up sharing. Because when you start to do that, things get even weirder. Because once you start to not only just compare catastrophes, but you start to compare ideologies, you start to compare similar stories that share the same kinds of migration patterns that we find in certain parts of the world that really should not be possible, or at least certain cultures should not have any recountings of at all. It gets crazy, right? There's all kinds of insane similarities across everybody's ancient histories. One of the things I want to talk about today is one of these aspects that gets ignored, especially in today's day and age when a very particular religion is under attack, right? And that would be Christianity. Now, before we go any further, I want to make it very clear that I am not a young earth creationist. I do not believe in God. There's none of that stuff. So this is not trying to convert anybody, but it's just something that we do need to discuss because we find this topic all over the planet. And that topic is the Tower of Babel. Now, when most people hear about the Tower of Babel, most people immediately write it off as fanciful garbage. And I don't disagree with you kind of on one hand. The concept of the Tower of Babel, it sounds very much like a flight of fancy. I mean, like, what do you, like, there's people are trying to build some sort of structure that will reach God, and then I guess they'll slap God. What are you going to do with that? Anyway, that's the story, right? And so it's kind of ridiculous because it takes 2 seconds to look at how tough it is to truly build any building. The taller you get, there's just problems. And then, of course, when we go back in time, to when this stuff would have, in theory, have been happening, those people were not, rocking huge steel buildings. They were not using gigantic cranes or any kind of modern building techniques that we would use to attempt to kind of do something like that. But, ultimately, the reality is, at the end of the day, pretty much everybody understands intuitively that building a tower like that would never work, right? Nobody's like, oh yeah, this could have worked, bro, but God got in the way. God literally probably didn't have to do anything, right? I think that's probably the funniest part, at least of the Christian version of the story, is that God seems to be afraid that humans might accomplish this. The reality is God should have just sat back, drank a beer and laughed his ass off while humans did what they were doing. There was really no reason to even create this story, and that's kind of my point. So it brings up a really important point. The story itself doesn't really make sense, at least not from a physical version. Because like I said, if God is all whatever, if God is omnipotent, if God has all this power, humans building a tower up to meet him is dumb anyway, because God does not live in the sky in theory, right? God is an omniscient being. You're not building a tower to reach an omniscient being, right? The omniscient being would be the tower. It would be the people. It would be everything happening. It makes zero sense from a purely religious perspective. So when the Christian Bible says, God was like, nah, you guys need to be split up and I'm going to make you guys talk different languages. Yeah, you look at it and you're like, well, is that something that an all-powerful God would really do or care about? I mean, and ultimately for most people, the answer is no. Even religious people, because what happens with the general religious person? The general religious person nowadays, they will look at something like the Tower of Babel and they will say, well, it's just a euphemism. They're just trying to, it's symbolic of mankind's hubris, right? They're trying to, this is the excuses that the modern Christian will give for this story, which is hilarious. Because this is supposed to be the word of God, and then, the Christian believers, they just go against the word and they say, well, it doesn't really mean that. Let me interpret it in a completely different way, right? It's weird, right? Like, why, if you believe in this stuff and you believe this is the word of God, why are you not listening to your own Bible, right? Anyway, so it just goes to outline how hypocritical the entire situation is anyway. Now, this particular subject really could have just lain dead if we only found it in the Bible. The problem is that the story of the Tower of Babel is not just found in the Bible. And this is a serious problem for historians. On several different levels, because your modern historian nowadays, on average, they are not a religious person. They are more than likely some form of atheist. And I mean mainstream atheist. By that I mean they only believe in science, right? They only believe in like whatever they're told by Facebook and their current, academic institution. They are not going to pay attention to anyone else outside of these realms. It's not going to happen, right? So when a historian looks at this stuff, they immediately write all of this off because they just say, well, I mean, maybe there's some similarities, but, not really. And besides, the entire story has to be fake, so, we're just going to move on. There's no reason to pay attention to it. And that gets rid of your average historian. And then, of course, the religious person takes themselves out of the race to try to figure out what's going on, because they think it's some sort of an alliteration. right? They think it's symbolic. Okay, so then the religious scholar is generally removed as well. So we start removing all of these people who could have maybe figured something out, but they're diverted due to, I mean, to be blunt, corrupt beliefs, right? They're not open-minded, they're not paying attention, they just move on. But it's a serious problem. Why is it that other cultures all over this planet have the same story? Now, I'll be blunt, I have no answer for this either, but I find the subject fascinating simply because we keep finding it everywhere we go when we start to study ancient cultures and their mythologies. So I started digging around and I found that Immanuel Velikovsky had actually tackled the problem a little bit. So I don't know if he also comes to any kind of a conclusion, but what I wanted to do is just show you guys this evidence. I wanted to read this to you guys so that you could see that, hey, this might actually be something worth taking seriously, because it may have actually existed to some sort of an extent. Now, was the tower literally being built to go and challenge God in the sense of how Christians believe it would be in the book, right? If you take it seriously, I don't know. The Bible is a whole other, well, not only the Bible, basically any religious text nowadays, there's a lot of problems with all of them, right? And I know you atheists are sneering out there. I know, you're like, yes, of course there is. But it gets even weirder than what your average atheist understands about all of these texts. You know, a lot of atheists will still believe, or most people, I'll just say, you know, they still believe that even if the Bible is fake, you know, it's still like thousands of years old, right? It's still a conglomeration of stories that have been put together from thousands of years. That might not be the case at all. And in fact, all of the evidence, especially nowadays, with respect to chronology, is starting to show that not only the Bible, but a lot of religious texts that are generally considered ancient aren't that ancient at all. And by not that ancient at all, I mean, for example, you know, the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, they may have actually been written between the 1100s AD to like the 1400s AD. Yeah, I know, that might sound a little crazy even for an atheist, like a hardcore atheist. But that's the truth. That is what we are starting to find when we look at chronology. Now, that's a whole different subject, but I only mention it because if we look at hardcore religious texts that are talking about the Tower of Babel, and they were written during, say, the Renaissance or a little before that, it really begs the question, how long ago did the Tower of Babel story truly take place if it was real, to whatever degree that it is real? Right, so it just puts us in a really weird conundrum because we are so used to, when anybody looks at like biblical scholarship, right? Everything is, you know, a lot of stuff is in the BC era. There's some early AD stuff, you know, it's stuff like that, but it's a long time ago. It's not technically recent. But it might be the exact opposite. And if it is the opposite, if the Bible, if all of these religious texts, including the Quran, if all of these religious texts are relatively new, right? What kind of picture does this paint for a story like the Tower of Babel? Okay, anyway, you get it. Just throwing it out there. Anyway, let's go through some of the stuff that Velikovsky talks about, and let's just see what he says, and then we can incorporate this stuff into our chronological studies, and we'll go from there. Because it's fascinating. You know, one of the other reasons why this stuff is fascinating is because language is a legitimate problem on this planet. And by language, I mean the study of language. Where the hell did it come from? Like, how did it really evolve? Where did the complexities originate? This is an actual problem in the historical study of linguistics. Most people don't realize this. A lot of people literally just think that we went from ooga booga to speaking modern day English, right? And there's just this nice, perfect, upward trend of complexity, and it just magically gets to where we are today. The reality is the exact opposite. We do not have any evidence to support ooga booga to modern day languages. It doesn't exist. Like, there's nothing there. We can track the evolution of languages that already existed, right? So we can go look at, say, for example, the Romance languages, right? We can track some stuff through there. We can see how they changed. We can see how modern day Greek has changed very little from supposed ancient Greek, right? We have seen and can track how English has changed over the years. What we do not have is where all of these languages came from and how they were devised and how they morphed into what they eventually would morph into in today's day and age. We don't have it. So, the Tower of Babel matters with respect to languages because we have a story where we have everybody apparently speaking one language, and then magically, suddenly, everybody starts to speak, 20 million different other languages, which of course stops the building of the tower. So the question we can ask, basically, there's a lot of questions that we can ask. I know I'm ranting, I know, hold on. But one of the questions we can ask and need to ask is, why does anybody even have this story in the first place? Right? Why did the different languages, why did this have to come from the construction of a large structure designed to get to God? Like, why this particular way? The religious people in any religion, they really could have created any kind of thing they wanted. I mean, they could have gone crazy with it, right? They could have taken shrooms and said that, I don't know, a frog showed up, it started licking people, and then suddenly people started speaking different languages, and then the frog would sit on your head, and it would tap down. It just gets crazy. Like, they could have done whatever they want, but for whatever reason, we find a situation to where a lot of ancient cultures blame languages, or at least the differentiation of languages, on a particular event dealing with a structure that is being built. I don't know, it's just something to think. It's a legitimate question, right? Because anyway, let's get into Velikovsky and what he has to say about this, and then, we'll use this for foundational stuff later in other schizo videos. Okay. Alright, so what I want to read today is off of the Velikovsky archive, so you guys can go get that. I'll try to put the link, if I remember, in the description. But there's all kinds of amazing, great stuff here to go read. And a lot of it is in short snippets, so it's not going to take you 10 million years to go through it. Alright, so Velikovsky's first little article is called The Confusion of Languages. The sequence of events as presented in the book of Genesis places the catastrophe of Babel next after the deluge. Quote, "And the whole land was one of language and of one speech. And they said, Go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all of the earth." The rabbinical sources explain that the purpose of the tower was to secure a shelter for the city of Babel in case the deluge should occur another time. Oh, that's interesting. All right. Quote, "The men who were before us God has destroyed with a deluge. If he shall again think fit to be wroth with us, and seek to destroy us even with a deluge, we shall all perish to a man. But come, let us prepare bricks and burn them with fire, that they may withstand the waters, and building them together with asphalt, let us make a high tower, the top of which shall reach to heaven, in order that being delivered from the deluge, we may find safety in the tower." Unquote. Yeah, that's interesting that it's a different version, huh? Alright. Well, see, I didn't know that. Cool. This purpose of the builders is found also in an account of this catastrophe, which the Aboriginals of Central America transmitted from generation to generation. Ixtlilxochitl, after narrating the story of the deluge, which brought to a close the First World Age, Atenatiu and destroyed most of mankind, described the catastrophe which ended the Second Age, or, and I'm going to screw up this pronunciation, Eheketonetui, quote, the son of the wind, unquote. Ah, interesting, which ended the Second Age of the son of the wind. And so would that be a direct relation to Saturn novaing? I wonder. Damn, alright, okay, quote, moving on, quote. And as men were thereafter multiplying, they constructed a very high and strong Zakawali, which means, quote, a very high tower, unquote, in order to protect themselves when again the second world should be destroyed. At the crucial moment, their languages were changed, and as they did not understand one another, they went into different parts of the world. The same author also gives another version of the same catastrophe. Quote, when 1,715 years had passed since the deluge, men were destroyed by a violent hurricane, Huracan, which carried off trees, mountains, and people, and great buildings. Although many men and women escaped, especially those that were able to take refuge in caves and places where this great hurricane could not reach. Yeah, that's interesting. So I think, and I'm guilty of this as well, I think most people get the general idea about the Tower of Babel being constructed to reach God. But what we are already seeing here is that multiple cultures actually have different reasons for building the tower. And one of those reasons appears to simply try to get away from the next flood. Now that would make sense, right? So people, I could easily see that. People are just like, you know what? Build as high as you can build, and hopefully the flood waters won't get to us. All right. Very interesting. Let's keep going. What else do we got? All right. Similarly, wrote Gomorrah, quote, the wind which occurred at the time was so great and of such force that it overthrew all buildings and trees, and even broke mountains apart. Interesting. So they're actually blaming the destruction of the Tower of Babel on something like another catastrophe that hits Earth. And one of the main catastrophes these guys are talking about so far is the hurricanes. Now, hurricanes play an insane role during the Venus event. So it makes one wonder, are these people that are talking, or should I say the people who built the Tower of Babel, whoever the hell they were they destroyed by the Venus event? Is the Venus event what took care of the Tower of Babel? So in that case, yeah, they would still blame gods for it because, you know, Venus would have been up there. Okay, well, anyway, let's keep going. Many sources which recount the destruction of the Tower of Babel maintain, in close accord with the Mexican account, that the catastrophe was caused by a violent wind. Thus, the Sibyl is said to have prophesied, quote, when are fulfilled the threats of the great God with which he threatened men, when formerly in the Assyrian land they built a tower, and all were of one speech, and wished to rise even till they climbed unto the starry heaven. Then the immortal raised a mighty wind, and laid upon them strong necessity. For when the wind threw down the mighty tower, then rose among mankind fierce strife and hate. One speech was changed into many dialects, and earth was filled with diverse tribes and kings. Alright, so I'm liking this. So check this out. If the Tower of Babel was ever real at any point in time in history, it most certainly would have been affected by one of the following catastrophes that Earth went through. Now, the Venus event would have been probably one of the most destructive events that everybody would have witnessed and dealt with back in the day after, you know, the deluge situation. So yeah, if you had built some large tower and then the Venus event happens, down it goes. What's interesting is that everybody is describing the exact same method of the destruction of the tower. Like, why the hell does Mexico know about the tower when it's supposed to be over there in the Middle East, supposedly, right? Like, what the hell's going on? How do these people know to talk about the Tower of Babel? Even funnier, they even talk about the languages being, diversified, so to speak, right? They know that detail. Why even add that detail? Like, there's too many commonalities here, right? We can't ignore that. All right, let's keep going. Where was I? All right. In the book of Jubilees, it is said that, quote, the Lord sent a mighty wind against the tower and overthrew it upon the earth, unquote. The Babylonian account, as transmitted by Abedinus, tells that once men, quote, built a high tower where now is Babylon, and when it was already close to heaven, the gods sent winds and ruined the entire scheme. And men, having till then being of all the same speech, received now from the gods many languages, unquote. The language thing is the thing I think that I find even more important than our ancestors attempting to build a huge tower, right? Building a huge tower, it would be an engineering marvel, right? If you get that thing going, that would be really impressive. But, and as cool as that is, I mean, the language thing, how the hell, what do they mean when they say the languages change? They're all of these people, even the Christian version, by the way, they're like blaming multiple agents coming down and doing this some way. I don't know. How do you do, like, what's the explanation for that? Are they really trying to say that, yeah, over time, people's languages split after the catastrophe? Let's just say that it's the Venus event that takes it down. That event definitely spread everybody over hell and back. But do they mean that everybody from there on kind of created their own languages after they were split up? Or are they being honest when they say, hey, look, this stuff happened, and then all of a sudden, pow, everybody was speaking a different language? Right? I don't know. It's just interesting that everybody says it like that. I mean, if we are going to look at this honestly, we need to listen to what they are saying. Yeah, and they're not saying that this took time. It sounds like it was instantaneous. I don't know. Anyway, here, let's keep going. Other accounts give the impression that a strong electrical discharge, possibly from an overcharged ionosphere, found a contact body in the high structure. According to a tradition known to the 12th century traveler Benjamin of Tudela, quote, fire from heaven fell in the midst of the tower and broke it asunder, unquote. In the tractate Sanhedrin of the Babylonian Talmud, it is said, quote, a third of the tower was burnt, a third sank into the earth, and a third is still standing, unquote. I love that line because a third of it is still standing. I wonder if it's still standing today, and we can see it, like we know of the monument or the ruin or whatever it is, but we do not know that it may actually be the Tower of Babel. Right? That's entirely possible. What if one of these giant ruins that we see on Earth right now was indeed, a piece of the Tower of Babel? That's one of the things that has always fascinated me with that statement from the Babylonian Talmud. It's telling, if it's still here and it's that big, it might still be visible and we can still study it today. Okay. The Tower of Babel story was found in the most remote parts of the world prior to the arrival of missionaries in those places, thus before the biblical account became known to the Aborigines. For instance, on the island of Hau, part of the Tuamotu or the Tuamotu Islands in Polynesia, The people used to tell that after a great flood, the sons of Rata, who survived, made an attempt to erect a building by which they could reach the sky and see the creator god Veta, or Eta. But the god in anger chased the builders away, broke down the building, and changed their language so that they spoke diverse tongues. It's the same thing, right? Like, why are we now finding this over in Polynesia? Right? This is the kind of stuff that historians completely ignore. And it's insane. Like, how do you ignore this? If people are talking about the exact same kind of historical accounts and they're lining up all over the planet, I mean, that's got to count it's got to count for something, right? I mean, you can't see these stories and ignore them. Right? You can't do that. So just make sure you're not doing that. I understand, those of you out there who really hate, Bible stuff, but it doesn't matter if the Bible's real or false. It's still an historical document. Just like everybody else's old religious accounts, they are still historical in nature. So do not discount them. That's crazy stuff, man. All right, let's keep going. The question of biblical influence was discussed by the folklorists. Quote, they, the natives of Howe, declared that this tradition existed already with their ancestors before the arrival of the Europeans. I leave to them the responsibility for this declaration. All I can certify is that this tradition contains many ancient words which today are no longer understood by the natives. Unquote. That's also another fascinating thing, right? One of the more obscure aspects of history when you start to really dig deep into an ancient culture is you find remnants of some long lost language. And I don't mean some long lost version of the language that they currently speak. That's not what I mean. No, it's literally a completely different language that their ancestors spoke, and it's in their stories. And for a little while, by a lot of accounts, especially with the North American Indians, there was a point to where that language was still being taught for a while, and then it basically died out. You can actually go, I think Manly P. Hall may have actually found one of those guys. He did a book with one of them. One of the interesting parts of that story was that Manly P. Hall, for whatever, wow, he's a 33rd degree Mason apparently. Anyway, he had access to some ancient texts, and he showed these texts to this American Indian. And the American Indian immediately lit up, and he was like, yeah, my ancestors used to be able to speak and read that language. Unfortunately, he didn't know how to read it or speak it at the time because that tradition had been long lost. And that's a theme that we see everywhere in today's day and age. Whenever we start digging further back into other people's cultures, it is interesting that we do find a lot of cultures have this mysterious ancient language, right? There are still writings on this planet that we have no clue what they translate into, right? We don't know the Rongo script, for example, right? There's a lot of stuff out there, but it's fascinating to hear people, recounting their oral traditions and being able to correlate certain kinds of writings and languages as something that their ancestors used to know and speak, but is now completely lost to us nowadays. You know how much stuff we are missing in history? That's insane. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy. We're screwed if you think about. Okay, let's go on. Where the hell was I? The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiche Mayas, narrates that the language of all the families that were gathered at Toulon was confused, and none could understand the speech of the others. The Casca Indian story makes the result into the cause. The Indians narrate that, quote, a great darkness came on, and high winds which drove the vessels hither and thither. The people became separated. Some were driven away. Long afterwards, when in their wanderings they met people from another place, they spoke different languages and could not understand one another, unquote. With this exception, the Casca story may refer to any great upheaval and is actually an effect of a large-scale migration. The traditions of peoples make the catastrophe the immediate cause of the confusion of languages and the dispersion as well. Alright, so if this story is indeed directed towards the Tower of Babel story, then this would correlate the idea that over time, people's languages changed after the catastrophe. Alright, so that's cool. So that means that we may have both sides of these possibilities, but also these guys' story may also not necessarily correlate with this exact catastrophe. You know, and that's something that we do have to be careful of, right? Remember, one of the things that can happen is that we can accidentally lump in different catastrophes as the same catastrophe. So, you know, anyway, we got to be careful of that. And that's what we're doing here. Okay, you get it. Moving on. While the account in Genesis and that given by Abydos and various other sources connect the story with a certain place in Mesopotamia, other traditions localize it in many different countries. In each case, the entire population of the world is said to have been affected. If the nature of the catastrophe was cosmic, the same occurrence could have taken place in different countries. In this case, the existence of similar traditions in many corners of the globe is of no avail for tracing the migration of ancient tribes. The Arabic tradition makes South Arabia the scene of the upheaval, followed by confusion of languages and migrations. Similar experiences could have been brought about by one and the same cause in many places. Remember that if it was indeed the Venus event that did this, everybody would have had to deal with it. However, it's still weird that we're still talking about some sort of building that was trying to essentially reach up to heaven or the stars. And I get that a lot of people are saying it's to avoid the next flood. I mean, did everybody build some huge-ass temple? I don't know. See, okay, I don't know. It appears that after the flood, the plain of Mesopotamia became one of the few cultural centers of the world. Another flood would have caused the utter destruction of the human race. And this was feared because the memory of the flood a few centuries earlier was very vivid. Huh. So, you know, interesting. A few centuries. Wouldn't that be a trip? Wouldn't that be crazy if the, Saturn novas, everything goes crazy and the Earth, the Earth is inundated by the deluge, from the Saturnian nova or the pre-Saturnian nova. And then, the water drains relatively quickly into what we have as the oceans now. It wouldn't take millions of years to drain all that water. The ocean, the water would have found its equilibrium pretty damn quickly. That's what water does. So, man, a few centuries after, I wonder. This is one of the things that I find fascinating with chronology, because right now, even, mainstream, they're gone. But even on the alternative side, everybody's still, they still adhere to Scaligerrian chronology, and they still use uniformitarianism, which makes everything older than it may be. I find it interesting that they're willing to make the claim here that the flood was only a few centuries before the next catastrophe hit Earth, which of course would have been the one that destroyed the Tower of Babel and did all kinds of other stuff. It's funny, that's not out of the realm of possibility. Like I said, chronology is making everything not as old as mainstream likes to claim it is. Is it possible that the Venus event is only a few centuries after the flood? I don't know, that's possible. I mean, okay, alright. Observations of the movements of the heavenly bodies may have provided a warning of a new catastrophe, and large structures were built for refuge. But when the event came, the structures were overwhelmed and destroyed by hurricanes and powerful electrical discharges. And of course, this correlates with not only everybody else's mythologies, but this also correlates with all of the scientific evidence that we now have on Earth, right? These two are married now scientifically. It's just interesting, the time scale. The time scale is one of the big problems that we have with respect to catastrophes and all of this stuff. We have to throw out mainstream chronology because at this point we have scientifically proved that mainstream chronology is completely wrong. I mean, it's bonkers. It's insane. There's plenty of stuff on this channel about all that garbage. Anyway, but it does indicate that perhaps, all of this stuff didn't take place all that long ago, which means that you and me are closer to it, which then, of course, has some pretty huge ramifications for who and what humans actually are. Yeah, that's a completely different show, but this is the kind of stuff which really highlights how little we truly know about what a human is, where we came from, what's going on. Ugh. Okay, let's finish this. In the rabbinical concept of the 7 Earths, molded one out of another in successive catastrophes, the generation which built the Tower of Babel inhabited the 4th Earth. But it goes on to the 5th Earth, where the men become oblivious of their origin and home. There you go. Those who built the Tower of Babel are told to forget their language. This generation is called, quote, the people who lost their memory, unquote. The earth which they inhabited was the 5th Earth, that of oblivion. That kind of correlates with what, the Yuga cycles, right? We're in the Iron Age right now, the Kali Yuga, so the bad age. Just funny, just saying, there's a lot of similarities in the way that cultures across this planet, quantize time. It's very interesting. Okay. In the ancient Mexican traditions, it is told that those who survived the catastrophe of the, quote, son of the wind, quote, lost their reason and speech. Why is everybody focused on this? Why is it that this is the only catastrophe, by the way, to where we can definitively point at it and say, hey, look, languages for whatever reason changed here. This is the key point in human history to where languages split. Right? It's funny, actually, there's some electric research on this. Let me just say this really quick and we'll move on. During the Venus event, there was a lot of static discharge, basically, electromagnetic discharge between Earth, between Venus, going on in the planets themselves, between the ionosphere and the ground. Basically, there was a lot of people getting zapped by electricity. There's a small idea, which I found interesting, that is it possible that the electromagnetic field of the Earth, we know the electromagnetic field of the Earth was permanently changed during the Venus event, right? The electromagnetic situation that we basically have now was created during the Venus event. But there's a train of thought that reads, is it possible that all this electrical stuff that was going on, all of this electrical activity on the planet, how did that affect human physiology and psychology on the neural level? Did all of the electrical activity that was going on during this period in time, did that affect the brains of humans in some way or another? Now, I know that sounds kind of crazy, but there's a lot of legitimate science that goes into controlling people electromagnetically, right? I mean, that's literally how, you can find tons of science on this. So what if it happened en masse over the entire planet all at once, and the electrical activity was actually able to completely change and shift human consciousness or human psychology? I'm not saying it happened, but it is something to think about. We'll explore that in another show. Okay, let's keep going. We're almost done. The characteristic of this catastrophe was its influence upon the mental or mnemonic capacity of the peoples. Oh, okay, here we go. The description of it, as told by many tribes and peoples, if it contains authentic features, arouses the surmise that the Earth underwent an electromagnetic disturbance, and that the human race experienced something in modern terms seems like a consequence of a deep electrical shock. Oh, he already talks about it. Okay, I jumped ahead. How do you like that though, right? Like, is it possible that the entire human race was psychologically augmented at this point in time? Is that what caused all of this confusion? Right? All right, last paragraph. The application of electrical current to the head of a human being often results in a partial loss of memory. Also, a loss of speech may be induced by the application of electrodes to specific areas of the brain. Yeah, how do you like that? Velikovsky was already on top of it even back then. So anyway, something to think about. And remember, this is based on science. This is not crazy stuff. Right now, you can go and read all kinds of research papers dealing with how electromagnetism influences and can even control human thought, right? I mean, and there's a whole science there about all of that. We're coming up on the end here, so I'm not going to get into any of that. But think about, isn't that crazy that if we have electromagnetic disturbances and we have one hell of a catastrophe being blamed on, it sounds like multiple gods, every one of those quotes we read, by the way, they don't blame it on one god. They actually, they use the plural form, or something like agents or something like that. It's not necessarily straight up God. Also, something to take away from this, because I kind of always blamed like the one God situation as well. But what we just read, I mean, this puts that entire situation in a completely different light, right? So the takeaway from this is we have to contend with the fact that cultures all over this planet seem to recount the exact same problem happening at the exact same time, right? And there's more, by the way. Velikovsky, he just picks out some, and I'm glad because I've been reading too long and we're moving on. But there's all kinds more examples out there. We'll go into more of this in another show later. But what we just went over has the potential to answer all kinds of historical and scientific questions that right now don't make any sense to the mainstream, right? Like I said at the beginning of this video, everybody ignores the fact that everybody has these exact same stories, right? We need to stop ignoring this. We have to deal with it. And in dealing with it, this might actually lead us to trying to figure out or being able to figure out what the hell happened to humans recently that made us the way we are now instead of how we were before. Yeah. All right, we're done. That's enough of this. Go enjoy life. Have fun. Swim, eat, be happy. Don't watch TV or movies. They're garbage.